You're listening to the 2017 Nelson Arts Festival Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers program. This session features Rebekah White and Dave Hansford in conversation with Veronika Meduna. Thank you. Hi, everyone. You guys all right? Yeah. I'm just waiting for a few more people to come in. My name's Naomi Arnold. I'm the Page and Blackmore Readers and Writers coordinator, and delighted to have these three brilliant science journalists here today. Veronika will be... Oh, let's clap. I'll let Veronika Meduna introduce each of them, but this is Dave Hansford and Rebekah White. Just want to say a big thank you to our sponsor, Page and Blackmore, without whom this event wouldn't be able to be put on. So thank you, Joe and team. And many of you will know Veronika from years working at Radio New Zealand as a science reporter. Her dulcet tones have enlivened many Thursday nights, so I'll leave everyone in her capable hands, and thank you very much for coming.
It's my pleasure now to introduce our two speakers, who are among two of the best science writers, journalists. We had that discussion early on, whether we are journalists or writers in the country, really. Dave Hansford here, lives here in the Nelson region now. Started out as a photographer at a time when Wellington still had a morning and an evening paper. And as he mentioned last night, it was a time when he was still shooting in black and white. So it's a while ago. For the last decade and a bit, he's been focusing on writing about science, conservation, biodiversity, with passion and compassion, in a number of magazines mostly, but a lot of his writing you will see in New Zealand Geographic. Last year, he's added another title as an author and published Protecting Paradise, which is over there, and I think there'll be a book signing session afterwards. It's a book on 1080, and as you can imagine, everywhere where Dave's gone since, it's created a strong debate at the best of times. And then earlier this year, he was awarded the Queen's Services Medal for his environmental journalism. Rebekah White is the editor of New Zealand Geographic. So Dave's writing is mostly going to New Zealand Geographic, and Rebekah recently took on the editorship. Before that, she was editing Pro Photographer, and before that, she was the deputy editor of a magazine called Good during its earlier years, where its focus was very strongly on science. And during all these years, while she was managing other people's writing, she's always also written herself on some of science's big issues: vaccination, fluoridation, biodiversity, conservation, climate change. That's the sort of topics that we'll probably touch on, because we'll end up talking about some of those asymmetrical debates that we have in the space of science. Last year, I was very lucky to spend a few days in the field with Rebekah on Whenua Hou, Codfish Island, and we were traipsing around the island day and night in pursuit of kakapo during their breeding season. So I've had a little bit of an insight into her craft, really, the exquisite attention to detail that comes through her writing. Now, before we start, you will have a chance to ask questions in the later part of the session, but the session is also being recorded to then be made available as a podcast. So what that means is that when your questions come, I'll end up repeating them, but I also want to mention it now early on so that you all know that this is being recorded. Shall we get underway? Can I ask either of you, each of you first, to share a good experience? A science writing experience that had joy and, good results about it, something that you really loved.
I think my favourite story that I've worked on so far is one that I did on canopy species, and it began with the concept that we know more about what's 30 metres under the sea than we do about what's 5 metres above our head in the canopy of the forest. So I went and interviewed the handful of people who are studying canopy species and climbed Upper Kahikatea to have a look for myself, and it was so rewarding because nobody had really paid attention to these researchers before, but more importantly, it seemed to change people's views of the forest. After they read the story, they told me about going for a walk and then being able to imagine the trees above them as sort of like island communities full of life. And even now, when I go for a walk, my knowledge of the forest is completely upended. I look up, and I realise that there's as much life above my head as there is under the ground. That one was really cool.
Yeah, just a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from a pest control group on the Coromandel who had been battling for years to get landowners in their district to give their consent for an aerial drop of 1080, and they were delighted to send me an email to say that they had just secured the last and most intransigent landowners' permission to go ahead. And this was a really valuable operation too. It was part of the Moiho Environment Group program. And I was delighted to think that something I'd written had been able to bring about some sort of positive change for biodiversity. It's not often that we get any kind of tangible evidence of the fact that somebody's actually read us.
Could I turn this around and ask you for the opposite, an experience of working on a project, writing, that challenged you or had a kind of a reaction to it that you didn't enjoy?
You've probably got better stories about this than I do, Dave.
I suspect so.
My worst experiences are generally related to interpersonal relationships between the people that I'm interviewing rather than the science. I haven't had the kind of attack that I imagine that you've had.
I've actually gotten away very lightly. I have to acknowledge that while I've received an awful lot of vitriol online since the book came out, most people have been relatively dignified in presenting me with their disagreement over 1080, and I want to thank them for that. I've had a much less agreeable experience at the hands of the organised climate change denial industry. And we have to go back now to the mid to late 2000s when I was writing for The Listener. But I wrote a piece which demonstrated the financial links between the New Zealand so-called Climate Science Coalition. Going back through a lot of US tax records, I was able to demonstrate that they'd received funding from a neoconservative think tank in the United States called Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, who had in turn received its funding from ExxonMobil. And this was duly published in The Listener. 2 weeks later, the editor there was threatened with a lawsuit from the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, and their letter also contained a demand that I be sacked immediately, and I thought this was telling, never be allowed to write about climate change again. And I was still laughing when my phone rang and Pamela Sterling called up to say that my services at The Listener were no longer required. And it got much, much worse, but very quickly this incident was picked up by mainstream media. Failed to appreciate the gravity of it, but it was picked up by, among others, Gareth Rinalden, who writes the climate blog Hot Topic, who ran it very, very hard until he was threatened with an injunction by The Listener and told to write a disclaimer or be shut down. And weeks later, I was surprised to find an extremely unflattering profile of me in National Business Review, which focused mainly on the fact that I was an extremely difficult personality, known for getting things wrong, with a long and sorry history of arguments with editors. And that was when I first began to appreciate, I guess, the vehemence with which independent and evidence-based journalism was being opposed by essentially conservative / right-wing media and corporations. It was really sobering. Yeah.
Would you agree that climate change now, at this particular time, is one of the science topics that has the most organised lobby against it, or against the increased knowledge of it?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And the
Would you
most
agree with that?
powerful as well, the most well-financed.
Yeah, so the most corporate,
Yes,
strong.
certainly.
Yeah. As science writers, can I ask you, you've already touched on, just telling these stories. Now, what your aim actually is. You're both keen outdoors people. You're both clearly passionate about conservation, big science topics, and the kind of what writers do. This, I don't want to call it translating because it's much more than translating. The storytelling about science. But when you set out to write a piece, do you write it because you're learning a lot, which you touched on about your own learning about the canopy species? Is it about trying to communicate the topic to other people, or is it about changing behavior?
I see my role as attempting to encourage people to look again at something that they might not have thought twice about, whether that's the canopy or worms or something that seems, or soil, or something that seems from the outset really boring. And I feel my role is to demonstrate the wonder and the magic that exists in some of those things. I also have long felt that I feel one of my roles is to dispel or to reduce the sum of fear in the world, because I think, especially when it comes to science communication, there's a lot of fear-mongering, and whatever the opposite of fear-mongering is, I don't know if there's a word for it, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think when I write a story, my main concern is I would love to excite wonder in a reader. I would love them to learn and come to understand something that they hadn't, like you say, Rebekah, necessarily considered before or simply didn't know before. And I have to say that having done that, I would like to think that I could get people to care, because, of course, unfortunately, so much of the stuff that we write about nowadays finds itself in some kind of peril, particularly, of course, when we're talking about biodiversity.
Or including us, really. I mean, climate change is an example where we are in peril.
Yeah.
And I guess it's true that unless you know about something, you're not going to care, and if you don't know, you don't care, and you don't do anything. So maybe it's a step along the way.
I think part of it's also sort of recontextualizing ourselves in a way, in that it's very easy to think of us as separate from the natural world, whereas I feel a lot of my work has been to demonstrate some of the connections that do exist that we don't necessarily notice on a day-to-day basis.
We do live in a time, though, where it seems that individual rights, individual interests, individual opinions count for more than they perhaps used to. Everybody seems to have a sense that whatever they think is the right thing. We also live in times where the trust in both science and media cannot be guaranteed. And what you said before, you can't always assume that people read your stuff in the first place. So how do you even start to counter that or recognize that?
I personally feel that media distrust as a whole is it's more granular than that. I am privileged that I work for a publication that's existed for 28 years, and I feel that there is a lot of trust placed in this particular magazine, and its approach is different, and it's very clearly very broad and non-opinionated as well. So I feel I've got that as a fortification against some of the changes that have happened to other forms of media. What do you think, Dave?
I think that we live by general agreement in what's been described as a post-truth era, and that concerns me deeply, because there is as much, if not more, truth in general circulation than there ever was, simply because we know more, and the communication is so much better nowadays. So I'm concerned about where that notion is coming from. I still think that trust is as important as ever been. I never assume that I simply have somebody's trust by right. We all know that we have to earn it. We all know that we are craving a reader's indulgence. And so it's up to us to keep our act squeaky clean. And I don't know about you, but what keeps me awake at night is the dread of that letter to the editor pointing out something that I got wrong, fundamentally
Exactly.
wrong. in a story,
Yeah.
and it behoves us to make sure that we keep our standards of reporting absolutely squeaky clean and top notch.
Yeah, you can show you're working to a degree, but you do bear a lot of responsibility because you know that anything that you publish is, it's a matter of public record. And so we have, at New Zealand Geographic, we have a layer of fact-checking that we're privileged to have and not every publication now can afford.
Few publications, in fact, and even the
Few
step
publications can afford.
Even the step before fact-checking, what sub-editors used to do, copy tasting, another pair of eyes reading copy that's been written by a reporter. All of these functions are disappearing, at least in mainstream
So certainly
media.
on the web, there are stories that are published without a second pair of eyes having looked at them, and that's quite common now.
Can I bring in social media here? Because for me, that is one of the, obviously one of the big changes that has happened in the last decade and a bit is that digital disruption, which has caused all sorts of good and not so good things. But on the matter of trust, has it helped or not?
On the matter of trust, I think what's happened is that with social media, the problem from our point of view is that everybody's a publisher, whether it's a person without much knowledge or a person with vested interests, and they're the people that we generally try and keep out of stories. But with social media, they have a platform to spread whatever they want to the world, and I don't know what to do about that. Do you?
We're looking to you
No,
for
I
sage
don't.
advice.
I mean, I believe in democracy, and I have to accept that social media is a new and very potent tool of democracy. But I do think it's unfortunate. Of course, there are no fact checkers or editors on Facebook, and bad information is proliferating at a quite frightening rate. And not unnaturally, a great number of people have seized upon social media as a vehicle to promulgate all manner of agendas, and of course the anti-1080 lobby is a classic example of that. And I can tell you, having spent the last 2 years of my life delving into that seedy underbelly, that it is a fact-free environment. And what bothers me, I think, is that in social media, people not only feel free, but assume that they've been granted a license to believe rather than think their way through issues. And this is a truly massive problem for society, I think. And it poses enormous questions for science communicators and for the agencies that produce the science, and also, I think, for the government agencies who are at the sharp end of applying it.
There's another aspect in it as well in terms of actually being able to produce high quality publications, whether that's a newspaper with quality journalism or a magazine that has come with a digital disruption. And we talked about that a little bit earlier about actually funding
Certainly,
an organisation like that.
I think the greatest impact of social media on the normal media is that media is funded not actually by people buying it on the newsstand, but by advertising. And many people don't realise this, but what's happened with social media is that money that used to flow to New Zealand publishers is now going to Facebook and to Google. And that's what's caused the dramatic cutbacks in staff. That's what's caused lower salaries in journalism. So you have less experienced journalists, less experienced science journalists, people who are leaving the profession when they want to have a family and need a little bit more income or stability. And that's really flowed through to all media, that loss of income. Of course, we still do incredibly value our readers, and it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario in that subscriptions are really valuable to media, because then you have a readership figure that you can take to advertisers and say, look, this is how many people are reading our magazine. Please continue to support us. But it's really, if you look at the graph of advertising spend in newspapers over the last decade, it's frightening. It goes like this. And it's hard for me to, there are many complaints that you could make about the media, but I know the conditions under which they're struggling and how different it was even from 10 years ago.
At this point, I should really give New Zealand Geographic a plug. New Zealand Geographic has, in fact, digitised all its content. So even going back through previous issues, it's all available
28 years.
on a digital platform, and you can subscribe to on a digital platform only, as well as, of course, for the magazine to be posted to your letterbox. Still with social media, you mentioned democracy, and social media is often described as democratizing information flows because everybody can publish whatever they think. Has it really done that, democratized it more, or has it made it more tribal?
I think it's done both. So, like all other platforms in society, I think you will always find people with agendas, venal interests, who will find ways to exploit the good in all of these platforms. This is nothing new. I'm old enough to remember when print media was all that we had, and even then people were able to drive agendas, and of course climate change denial is one of the classic examples of this. They were able to find ways to exploit what they considered to be a weakness in print media, which, and I'm talking now about our tenets of fairness, accuracy and balance, and we will presumably get into the topic of the asymmetrical balance in a moment. And so they found a chink, if you like, in the arm, and now to us, those tenets were our greatest strength, but to vested interests, they were their way to get inside the media and use it to their advantage. The same thing has happened with social media. So again, people have learned how to exploit the weaknesses inherent in the system, even as it's also, I have to acknowledge, it's still doing great good out there as well.
Shall we just stick with some of those asymmetrical debates for a bit? Because the tenets of fairness and balance in particular, which are really strong elements in how journalists are trained, they go back to a time when there was a two-party system, so you had to represent two sides in a balanced way. That doesn't seem appropriate anymore or useful in any context to do that. Yet most, and I'm thinking radio programs here rather than print media, but most programs still will have a double header, and if you have two people talking, we'll set them up as an argument rather than as two people actually discussing and trying to form bridges, reconciling. It tends to still be an argument. So is it time to review some of those approaches?
Certainly, the problem that Veronika is describing is when you get 100 people who think thing A and one person who thinks thing B, and at times in the media they can be presented as though their views are equal and they have equivalent weight, whereas in fact 100 people think this thing and one person thinks that. This has been a real problem in debates around genetic engineering or climate change, and I think that it has come from journalists either not having the confidence or the skill to report, to accurately weight information, but I think that is increasingly a requirement of journalists today. They need to be able to foreground and contextualise the information that they're receiving. The reporting process requires that we corroborate everything that we publish. It's not enough to have one person having an opinion. That we've got to check that they're telling the truth. And so as part of that process, you necessarily, people get kicked out of the story whose views are not, if they're a fringe view, you're not going to report that in the same way as you are going to report a strongly held consensus view. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't always happen. And for far too long, I think, graduates have come out of journalism school believing that balance was a mathematical formula, that it was 50-50. And one of the many myths I would love to see dispelled is that there are two sides to every story. There are not. There are dozens and dozens of sides to a story. And our hang-up, I think, with black and white or yes and no, or this false impression of polarisation is a real shackle that we have to throw off. The process that Rebekah's just described has a name now, I'm pleased to report. It's being called verification journalism. And out of that has arisen this notion, which is gaining favour, I'm also happy to report, of proportional balance. And there are a number of leading New Zealand journalism advocates and tutors who are now advocating strongly for exactly the process and the treatment that Rebekah just described. It's okay to acknowledge the fact that there is dissent, but it's almost a duty to report to people that that dissent is not based anywhere in any evidence.
I think you do need to report that dissent, though, in order to contextualise it within the. I think that you run into problems as well when you simply ignore it and it's not covered at all, because people might have heard something about it, and then if you have a story that doesn't include this other view, people might be wondering where it's located in relation to what you've described. So I think it's a difficult process.
It is, and that one raises the fascinating question which I raise. I've devoted a chapter on this, by the way, in my book. It raises the fascinating question of whether journalists are arbiters of the truth. And this is a great way to start a long argument in a bar. Because you will find people like myself who believe that we are. It is our job, nay our duty, to reconcile for audiences just what the facts of the matter truly are. And others will tell you that their job is simply to hold a mirror up to the society in which they operate and to reflect the full gamut of the range of views. And, you know, you will all have your own opinions on that one. It's a fascinating topic.
It makes me think of the process of science. There's a similarity between how quality journalism works, when it works well, and how science works. Can we explore that a little bit?
In terms of having to repeat your results.
Or being based on evidence, whatever conclusion you end up coming to, having something to back it up, some process that backs it up. So opinion versus analysis in journalistic terms. But also being able to say, okay, so what we thought 2 years ago about whichever topic has now advanced. We now have better understanding. Can you talk a little bit about the craft that you use in your writing? How would you address the fact that science isn't, it sort of is about delivering facts, but it's also a progression of understanding?
For me, I'm interested in increasingly reporting not just finished work, but work that is planned or work that is in progress, which is something that scientists really hate. They come from a system where you're only allowed to talk about things when they're finished and they're published and they're peer-reviewed, but I think there's a huge amount of value in showing the working and showing the process and what's in train of development. One of the real challenges in communicating science is that it's not fixed and it's in constant evolution. And especially in the news media, I think this is a very big challenge because you're continuously reporting different things. You don't have the ability to take a huge overview of a subject, and I feel that's something that we're able to uniquely offer, is to take a long view and show how knowledge has evolved or is developing, and show that there's a trajectory and that it will continue to evolve and develop. It's not a fixed thing.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think that there is perhaps a tendency for audiences to look to the media as the one authoritative source for their facts, but I would also argue that we have a responsibility, just as scientists do, to acknowledge and declare what we don't know as much as what we do know. And we need, I think, to relax a bit with the notion that there are still maybe some holes in a story. And I don't think readers mind that. I think they're perfectly happy to know that there's an awful lot of unresolved stuff, no matter what the issue is.
No one studied this. No one's finished studying this. Someone has only just started studying this.
That's right. Or there were only 2 studies done, and so we can't say...
And they were in 1992, so...
Yeah. How do you do that with climate change in particular? Because this is a story full of, incomplete answers, or sort of margins of error around conclusions, uncertainty, slow burning, far in the distance, yet so close. How would you tackle that as a writer? How do you approach stories on climate change?
In small pieces, with the attempt to connect it to a larger whole. I think it's a subject so vast that you can only, that it's most successfully communicated a slice at a time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's far too big to try to present as one single fait accompli in a magazine. And going back to techniques or devices that I might employ, and also going back to exciting wonder again, I think that even if a story or an issue like climate change appears to be something that's only happening to other people on the other side of the world, a lot of people here in New Zealand would appreciate that, in fact, if something is pointed out to them, that this does have ramifications in their everyday life. I'm sure all of you people have gardens, therefore you have probably noticed that things are different nowadays. And I think there are ways that you can go out and collect up people's experiences, which will start to build a picture that although we think that climate change is some amorphous phenomenon happening somewhere far away and in another time, if you stop and ask people, there might be this collective realization that actually it is already beginning to affect us.
A really good example of this is actually a story that Veronika did for the last issue of New Zealand Geographic, which on coastal acidification, and it shows, and it was fascinating reading for me because I didn't realise the extent to which it is occurring around our coasts in particular, because the effects of ocean acidification are more our coasts are impacted first, and it was eye-opening, and it brought a huge, vast international subject home to very particular places. I like
it. You should all subscribe to New Zealand Geographic. I was going to ask you a little bit more about the craft, and one of the things that's always concerned me is the duration between a discussion taking place within the scientific community or the academic community and the time it takes for it to become a public debate. I've experienced it in my own time as a long time ago, biology genetics student and then becoming a journalist. We talked about genetic engineering, moratoria, ethics, at least a decade before, in the academic context, at least a decade before it became a public issue. Climate change is not dissimilar. That the bodies in place within the UN, they're all 25 years old, nearly 30 years old. So as an issue, it's been around for a long, long, long time, but it's taken a long time before it is more of a public debate. How can we shorten that gap between something being recognized within the people who study it, work in it, and it entering a public discourse?
It starts with the scientists, but the scientists are starting to come around to the idea now, and we're going to see a resurgence of the debate around gene editing because there's been a great technological leap forward, which means that we can edit genes very quickly and very precisely. And having learned from the last time genetic engineering was in the news, scientists are now realizing that they need to not go off and do a whole lot of work and then come back and say, hey, ta-da, we can do this, we're going to do it now. They've realised that they need to bring people with them in terms of what they're trying to do and why. It's as one has said in a story we've just produced on it, if the scientist told our reporter, oh, well, if someone came along to me and said, trust me, I'm an expert, that would really get my back up too. So we don't want to do that. We want to talk to people about what we're doing and what we might use it for and why we will do it. And that's particularly being championed by one of the sort of inventors of this technique, who's a researcher at MIT, who's actually begun visiting New Zealand to hold public talks about ways in which gene editing might be used to achieve the predator-free 2050 goal. And he's trying to turn science on his head in a way, because he realizes with gene editing that it's such a it's a topic that people feel strongly about, that people need to know what's being worked on and they need to be brought along with that process. So within his lab, he he requires everyone to publish what they are working on online, which in science you don't do because then other people can steal your ideas. But he, even though it's a professional risk for him and all of his colleagues, he will publish online, okay, this is what we're trying to do right now and we're working on it at the moment. And he's saying, no, this is the way science needs to be conducted now, especially regarding subjects like this, which require the public to, we can't do it if the public says no, we need your input and your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it goes all the way back to what we opened with. It's about people's trust in not just the institution of science, but in the institution of media. So we all bear a share of the responsibility to make sure that these issues are discussed rationally and hopefully based in some evidence. And I've often thought that, particularly with CRISPR and gene editing, as you've just referred to, Rebekah, I think, it wouldn't be too difficult to gather up people's concerns and start working on those. The time is now because the technology, as you've just said, is advancing rapidly. And there's a very real danger that the technology will leave public understanding and perception behind and fail to address the very real concerns that people
very
would have.
Very legitimate concerns.
Mine immediately is that it flips New Zealand biosecurity on its head. For the first time, we will have to stop things getting out of the country. Are we ready for that? Can we demonstrate, for instance, that gene editing is reversible in the field? These are all questions that people are going to want to know. And I think, too, as part of a trust-building exercise with gene editing, I would suggest that there's plenty of opportunity to use gene editing for stuff that is not just about killing things. For instance, over there in the Cook Strait on the Brothers Islands now, you've got a population of tuatara that is in real trouble because of temperatures rising. You probably know that in certain reptiles, sex selection is determinant on the temperature inside the burrow. We're getting far too many male tuatara now. Okay. Now, I've always thought, for instance, that a great application for gene editing would be to interfere in that process and restore the appropriate balance, gender balance in these threatened populations. To me, that's an example of gene editing for good, if you like, that people, I think, would readily warm to and appreciate. I think there's applications like that we should be thinking about as a way of perhaps paving a way towards 2050. It shouldn't all be about apocalypse now.
Can I just throw something in here that while you were talking, I was reminded of the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification that we had, and I think it was just at the end of last century. So, again, a while ago. Yeah, but whakapapa is an issue in there, and that's a very legitimate concern. Are we better at, again, reconciling some of the legitimate concerns around technologies like that are helpful but also disruptive to normal biological processes? Are we better at that? Are we bringing in some of the social science and the sort of acknowledgement of broader concerns?
It's certainly we spoke to a handful of Māori scientists for the story on gene editing, and the opinion is very divided. Obviously, tangata whenua, not a single voice, but there were some scientists saying, look, this poses huge problems to the idea of whakapapa, and other scientists saying, hang on, this could be considered to enhance whakapapa, and that's okay, in the sense that it could be used for genetic rescue on species that have extremely limited genetic variability, of which New Zealand has quite a few. So, it's views are broad.
Do we have enough of the social science? You mentioned it before. Do we, for example, with a goal like predator-free 2050?
This is a bee that buzzes around in my bonnet all the time.
Yeah.
So I have actually been touring a presentation on this very topic. So I am a little biased about it, but I think it behoves us to understand much better the depth and the breadth and the variety of public perceptions out there around programs like Predator-Free 2050 specifically, but more broadly, given that we're now seeing what I will call science denial across a whole suite of issues, okay, be it climate change, be it vaccination, be it fluoride, folic acid in bread, 1080, we tend to see a certain commonality in the response from certain sectors of society. And when I was writing my book and I went out to academics and researchers asking them to describe that phenomenon, they couldn't. Now that tells me that we have been remiss, I think, in keeping up with researching public attitudes to advances in science, and particularly in the way that they are applied, and here I'm referring to broad-scale public programs like aerial pest control and vaccination. So yes, to answer your question very succinctly, there is a looming gap out there. I will point out that DOC recently embarked on a program of social research to run in parallel with the more technical aspects of pest control, which I welcome, but we could have been onto this 10 years ago.
And possibly should have been in other areas.
Absolutely.
Because that goal, would you agree that goal, predator-free by 2050, would not be achievable without genetic engineering techniques like gene drives?
Certainly not by 2050.
Yeah. So in a way, that's a goal that we can only...
But it also requires like a serious amount of social buy-in, in the sense that if we're going to have a predator-free country, that requires everybody in a city to trap, and be all right with either with some form of pest control throughout the cities as well as in national parks. And I don't see that happening without some kind of communication or program, or the kind of thing that really hasn't happened around pest control in New Zealand in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we came out, we were talking about facts and whether people's doubts could necessarily be assuaged simply by providing them with facts. And there is now in the United States a fascinating body of evidence beginning to grow, which is beginning to show that if you present people with very strong belief on certain scientific issues, they will simply cling ever more tightly to that belief when presented with contradictory facts. And this is really, in the one sense, we're all going, oh yeah, that's right, that does happen. But in another sense, that's come as a bit of a surprise, I think, to science communicators, and that's going to be an enormous challenge for all of us right across the spectrum. And so what I would say to that is that this comes back to the importance of the story. Facts on their own don't win arguments, if that's what we're trying to do. They certainly don't persuade people, the research is showing, but narratives do. And if you look for successful examples of this, and I've just been talking about this, Donald Trump won the United States election with a narrative. He didn't win it with facts. And so I think this is something we need to be cognizant of.
I think everybody with relatives knows that facts don't change people's minds. They're determined by the social group that you're a part of and the wider who you identify with as a person. And if you're challenging that identity, you're not going to get anywhere at all.
That's dead right. And something that happened to me repeatedly while I was on the road researching my book was if I felt safe enough in the environment, I would mention that I was researching a book on 1080. And the first question everybody asked me without fail, is it for or against? Now that's really telling, isn't it? Because A, they perceive it as a black and white polarized debate. Okay, there was no suggestion that somebody might, God forbid, delve into the nuance or present some of the negative aspects along with some of the positive aspects. But more importantly, they needed to know which tribe I belonged to before they were prepared to talk further. Yeah.
I want to talk a bit more about narrative storytelling techniques and how, even though a science story will always be factual and evidence-based, how we can do the storytelling better. But is anybody itching to ask a question in the audience? We've got another 15 minutes or so, so if there's any urgent questions, happy to take them now. Can we have one? And I'll open the last 10 or thereabouts minutes just for questions for you.
Presenting a story, there is often a transfer of units. So weight is 2.5 elements. A distance is 3 football fields. This volume is 2.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Is that good journalism?
I'll just repeat it because of the recording. So the question is, in science writing, we often try and translate numbers or measures into the equivalent of something that one can imagine, like a volume into the number of swimming pools. Is that good journalism?
Who in New Zealand has seen an Olympic-sized swimming pool? I think that's a terrible method of comparison, but I do think that those comparisons are useful when they refer to things within someone's experience. I quite liked, actually, Dave, who's just written a story on whitebait for New Zealand Geographic, described the whitebait as the size of a hairpin, which I think is something that's common to at least 50% of the population. He knows.
Well, I'm now ashamed to say that I used the Olympic-sized swimming pool comparison in my book, and I did so because I was trying to illustrate for readers the concentration of 1080, which had been detected in a water supply after an aerial operation in the Coromandel. And I could give them the figure in parts per million. But really, how much help is that? Who has a good understanding of what that is? So instead, what I did, and believe me, it was interminable, but I had to chase down the flow volumes for a certain river on that day at that time, and then I had to go back to Landcare and get the monitoring results, and I had to calculate the proportion of 1080 to the volume of water in the river. Okay, and as it turned out, it was exactly half of one drop from an eyedropper into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's what they detected, which was right on the limits of detection of ability. And I think in this case, whether it was good journalism, I'm not about to say, but I was just looking for a way to try to help people envisage that concentration.
I have to say I'm guilty of that Olympic swimming pool too. I think we've all used it. In my case, it was in the context of describing homeopathy and how the dilution of an active compound.
It's more successful for concentration than volume.
That's true, yeah, when you're talking
absolutely.
about very, 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 very low concentrations of something. And I've used it for percentages. When you say that 80% of our birds are threatened in some way, or if you say 4 in 5 are threatened, which is a stronger way of saying it. So I think we've all tried to not use too many numbers and try and
the problem is when
them.
things become so large, they become unfathomable. You do need a way to recontextualize it for people.
Especially with astronomy.
The margin of error versus standard deviation.
Well, you've hit on a good point here. Something that science writers grapple with all the time is we're trying to imagine who our audience is. And I have never successfully pinpointed the precise level of prior scientific knowledge of my audience because I can't.
It's impossible.
I can't know, for instance, out of all of you out there, some of you will have a very thorough understanding of some of the most arcane scientific principles, and some of you will not. So our job is to try to pitch a story somewhere in the middle, which is not so dumbed down that more educated readers will find it tedious, but also at a level where people with perhaps lesser scientific understanding can still grasp what we're on about.
Which brings me back to the narrative. I've noticed, just let me do one thing about storytelling. Brings me back to the narrative. So science deals with numbers and facts and all these things, and they need to be in the stories, but is there a way of using storytelling better? And one aspect of that is the people themselves. the people that you could just simply interview and quote and not describe, or you could talk about them as people with their own quest, including all the failures and everything.
I just want to take a step backwards from the point you're making and say that one of the challenges that I face as an editor is that often there are subjects that are so important and so worthy that sometimes journalists approach them from the point of view of everybody's automatically interested in this because it's really important. And that's not true at all. Everybody, for any subject, writers need to do the work to make it interesting, to take people by the hand and bring them into a subject. There's nothing so worthy that you don't have to do the work of making it really interesting. And there's a few ways of doing that, and one of those is through character. And scientists don't really like to talk about themselves or to talk about something that isn't their science, really. But having a person at the centre of a story whose passion and uniqueness and weirdness you can really get into is a really compelling thing. And when there's someone who cares really strongly about something, that I'm automatically interested in that, no matter what it is they're interested in. It's really it grabs you. And there are a couple of other things like that, like being able to talk about the stakes of a story if it's something that is going to become immediately relevant to someone's life, to put it in the context of their life. That's another way of bringing people into something. I had a third one, but I can't remember it right now. Maybe you've got some
Can you help out?
ways of bringing people into stories.
No, that's right. And I think, too, the real value of relating some of the characters that you meet in your travels when you're chasing down these stories is it helps to reinforce for readers that this is a collective human experience, that we're all actually on this journey of discovery. And we're all human, so, we've all gotten things wrong, we've all had blinding moments of realization. This is a very common and collective human experience, and I think good writing will reflect that, because we can all relate to it.
I'd like to return to the credibility question, which is a big problem for you as science writers, and a big problem for us as science listeners. And is this something that relates back to the origins of science, and scientists were looking for the truth, and they were not interested in the outcome at all, they were only interested in discovering the truth. And what has happened is that science has been hijacked an awful lot by commerce and advertising, and the public feel in a great deal of instances that it is not truthful. And how do you get over this problem? Where do you have the verification going? Do you have something like organic food, that you have an international body that people can go to and pay a small amount and actually have it verified, thinking in particular about the public media domain? Because I'm sure there's a mass of people who would love to have some sort of verification and certification, and that science would then generally have its credibility increased.
Restored.
And your jobs would be quite a lot easier.
So let me just summarize that for the recording. So this brings us back to the credibility of both science and our job in that space. And you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were saying that science perhaps used to be a more clearly truth-seeking profession, but has been more and more influenced by the funders coming with a commercial interest and with an outcome interest, and therefore the trust has decreased in the science. But how could we counter that? How could we return to the truth-seeking part of it?
Yes, the important thing also is that still a scientist is a seeker of truth.
Yes.
Not with an agenda to play for. They have an open mind and they want to understand.
So that the notion of objectivity or open-minded approach to any inquiry. Go.
I am of the opinion that journalists are not mirrors but arbiters of truth, and so that is something I feel that the best way to do that is to show you're working within a story as much as possible, in the sense that you do you as the journalist prioritise the information that you receive based on who's paying for things, or those are steps that you go through in the reporting process, and things that you use to balance or to weight the information that you receive in, and you choose how you present it as in terms of whose information is prioritised over who else's information. And it's difficult for the reader. It does require trust on the part of the reader, of you as the journalist. And I haven't fully answered this question for myself in terms of how I can build that, other than to show as clearly as I can the process that I go through in order to achieve the results that I do. What do you reckon?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it occurred to me a short while ago that we may yet end up, now that everything is digital and that we have links that we can click, that we may yet end up providing references, even in what I would call popular science writing for general consumption. I mean, that may not necessarily hurt. There are 30 pages of references in the back of my book, precisely because of what Rebekah's just alluded to. You have to be able to demonstrate the veracity of the statements that you're making. In other words, that you're not simply stating your own opinion, but that there is a body of evidence there to support that statement. And I actually take time to encourage people in that book to go back to those references and check for themselves. And I actually encourage them to question all the statements in that book as well. Because we're now, of course, we've arrived at the topic of critical thinking. And can I just say that I think if there were more to be done in particularly primary and intermediate school science education, where if kids would just be allowed to go back into the lab and do dangerous experiments with Bunsen burners and things like that, that they might start picking up some critically important skills in terms of being able to evaluate the veracity and the merit of information for themselves. In other words, teaching them critical thinking.
We did, in our earlier discussions, also touch on the publishing of science. Disclosure of any funding for any research would help, and a clearer context of how research is undertaken in the publishing of the results, and publishing of failed experiments
We
would
have a
also help.
problem in that we don't see the experiments that have failed, or the ones that did not produce the intended result, and so we don't know how many times something was not shown to A was not shown to be B, compared to the one time that A was B. Yeah, it's a real problem for everybody.
But that approach to opening up science and science publishing is a current debate. You know, the idea that everything should be disclosed and openly accessible, freely accessible too. So we can take one or two quick questions. One hand here and one hand in the back. And can I just say that you'll hang around for a little bit if there's any more questions, but in terms of our time here, if I go here and then there.
This is not something that I've personally encountered. How about you?
It's not something that comes up a lot, but I would make the observation that all too often it's actually government departments and agencies that are the most keen to present findings, mainly because they want to be seen to be using science to support some kind of policy or action. And I find that that's often where I'm at my most wary, to be perfectly honest. I should say I have it easy because I almost never write health stories.
I was
But
going to say it's health. Yeah.
in health is rife with this kind of conflict of interest, and I can't.
We're
really
a little bit
comment.
sheltered from that in conservation. There's not a lot of money going around, so nobody's got a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Although in the context of climate change, I would,
Yes.
in terms of having, I might include a person's view, but with the disclosure of
But you would
either
also
where their funding comes from,
talk
where their
about their
background
funding.
is. So in that context, I would.
Well, the issue of trusting science and reproducibility and so forth is a big issue in science at the moment, particularly on journals like Science are discussing it an awful lot. people not believing things, particularly conspiracy theories. Science had a recent issue on the anti-vaccine business, and social scientists have found that the people who support conspiracy theories aren't the left-wingers, they're the libertarians. And that's one of the places where social science can help. I mean, 50 years ago, and there's a rather drunk Pons government have a social scientist writing its journal, but that is very much changing now.
So that brings us back to the importance of social science, and perhaps what is it that makes some people more prone to perhaps think about conspiracy theories? Or do you want to have a quick comment to that? We've got 1 more minute. So
your observation was bang on, I think, particularly with reference to climate change. If you look at where the hardcore climate denial is coming from, it almost exclusively comes from a conservative / right-wing political predilection. And it doesn't take an awful lot of thinking to see why, because the kind of broad-scale social and political revolution that is going to be required to combat climate change is anathema to a neoliberal agenda. So, I mean, I've simplified that greatly, but and so this is where the social science does come in. Of course, this is where science and psychology go hand in hand.
Even on a more everyday level, I believe that there's a sort of a tribe that has formed that has centers around the idea that what's natural is good and what's chemical is bad, and that manifests in a number of ways. But you can't. There's no facts that you can give them that will change their minds, because that value is rooted so strongly, and it's used to. That's why even you can. There are many studies disproving that, in fact, there's plenty of information that shows that 1998 publication in The Lancet around vaccines causing autism was a total fake. But you can't address that without addressing the value that anti-vaccination advocates hold dear, that natural is good and chemical is bad. That's what you have to address, not the issue of vaccinations.
Any closing comments from either of you before I thank you and everybody else?
I think the thing that I find myself when I hear an interesting claim from someone that I know is I constantly find myself asking them, where did you get that from? Like, have a look at your sources. That's what I have to do, and that's what it's hard work, I know, because I do it every day, but I find myself asking relatives, where are you getting this from? Do you want to look into that? Oh, that's some health advice given to you by a guy who doesn't have any kind of qualifications, but he calls himself a nutritionist and he sells vitamins. Maybe there is a conflict of interest there. I feel like I go on and on about this, but it's people, because there is so much information available now, it's up to you to check your sources, just like it's up to us to check our sources, especially if it's coming from a source that, if it's you don't know where it's come from.
Yeah, you did right, Rebekah. It can be fraught because, as I say, there are a number of sectors out there in society who are pushing various agendas, and they regard the media as a megaphone through which they can sometimes promulgate those agendas. And so the first responsibility, I think, for veracity rests certainly with the journalist, and the most fundamental and first choice is, do I actually interview this person at all? And that's where it's incumbent upon us to do our research, check this person's background, their connections, their links, and possible motivations. But the most powerful question, if it comes down to an interview, you can ask anybody is, how do you know that? And I never fail to ask that one if I'm in doubt. In other words, I'm asking them to stand up the claims they are expecting me to report.
That is an excellent closing point. Thank you very much on that. Dave Hansford and Rebekah White.